Hello, welcome back to another Trek Talk live stream. Okay, so this week, originally what I was going to do for this live stream was I was going to cover the period in between the first and second seasons of the original series, and then talk about Cat's Paw, which was the first episode of season two. Now, bear in mind, I'm going in production order here, not in the order that they were aired, and Cat's Paw was the first one produced. But it was just going to be too long, because I generally try to keep these under about an hour, and that was going to run closer to maybe an hour 40 minutes or something like that. So I'm just going to cover that sort of interseason period here, and then we'll get to Cat's Paw next week. And as always, I'll be reading from Mark Cushman's book series, These Are the Voyages, for behind the scenes information here. All right, now, Star Trek folklore tells us that the series failed in the ratings in perhaps every book that ever was attempted to cover the subject back during its initial run in the 60s. There have been newspaper articles, magazine articles, whole books, and of course, in the internet age, online articles about this information. And the experts behind all the information provide no proof of this. They have no documentation, just 45 years of insistence that that's the case. Now, the Nielsen ratings for all the episodes from the 66-67 season were published. And the numbers plainly show that Star Trek's first season was hardly a failure. It actually did fairly well. The real numbers show that they had so many times, as they had so many times since the September premiere, that Star Trek was holding well up against Bewitched, was the main show that kept beating it in the ratings. If it weren't for Bewitched, it would have been number one in its time slot. And it often beat My Three Sons on CBS, which placed at number 15 out of all primetime series in the previous year. But now that it was up against Star Trek, it had dropped out of the top 30. On October 31st, 1966, Broadcasting Magazine published results from a special study conducted by TVQ, which was a service of the Home Testing Institute. In a nationwide survey, TVQ asked its participants to pick their favorite shows. The results of this showed that in the 6 to 11-year-old demographic, Star Trek was number one. With teenagers 12 to 17, it ranked number three, just under Time Tunnel and I Spy. In the 18 to 34-year-old group, it was number five, after I Spy and the three networks' various primetime movies. 35 to 49, it placed number six. In the 50 plus crowd, it was in the top 10. When the survey asked participants to name their favorite new show and then averaged together the answers from the various groups, Star Trek was number one. Added together out of all the 90 primetime shows within all categories, Star Trek came in at number two, bested only by Bonanza. But remarkably, it was at the time NBC that was indicating that Star Trek being renewed for a second season was iffy. If ratings weren't truly the issue, then what was behind NBC being reluctant to renew the show? 20 years later, Roddenberry explained it, saying, quote, NBC was trying to reinvent itself for a younger audience. CBS had just taken Lost in Space. ABC had Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea. NBC decided to try one too, but science fiction was not a good fit at NBC. Nor was, according to Cushman, Roddenberry. He wasn't a good fit either. In late November of 66, Roddenberry met with Harlan Ellison at Oblast Restaurant, which was a luncheon joint just off the Desilu lot. The science fiction writer was working on a Star Trek script at the time and recalled, quote, Gene had a drink in front of him. He looked at me and said, they're conspiring to cancel the show. We were alone, and Gene was telling me that dark and inimical forces inside NBC were plotting the demise of this new series, to which I had become devoted. And he said, I need your help. Quote, NBC was lying in wait for him, Ellison told this author, confirming the network's agenda to rid itself of anything to do with Gene Roddenberry. Quote, and when we finished the letter writing campaign, they were astonished. They were amazed that they got thousands of letters. I knew how to pull the strings, and I pulled every string I could. Ellison returned to Desilu, this time using studio space, stationery, and equipment to create and manage what became known as the committee. He enlisted the aid of 7 of the biggest names in science fiction: Paul Anderson, Robert Bloch, Lester Del Rey, and Philip Jose Farmer, as well as Frank Herbert, Richard Matheson, and Theodore Sturgeon, and drafted a letter to spread the gospel of Star Trek, working for membership lists of various science fiction conventions, sci-fi fan clubs, and booksellers. Ellison and his cohorts sent out thousands of letters asking viewers to persuade NBC to keep Star Trek on the air. The committee declared Star Trek to be written, quote, by authentic science fiction writers and made with enormous difficulty and pride, unquote, and said that the series was about to, quote, suffer the Nielsen roulette game. The committee's letter created a buzz in the scientific community. With this first letter from the committee, the negative and irreversible folklore about Star Trek's place in the Nielsens began to spread. But in those first few months of 1967, it served a purpose as protest letters from Star Trek fans poured into the offices of NBC. The show's sponsors, newspapers and TV magazines as well. Now, some were not merely satisfied with writing letters. KRON TV, KRON TV, the NBC owned station in Oakland, California, was subjected to a demonstration march from the fans. Bijou Trimble, a science fiction enthusiast that Gene Roddenberry had met at Tricon in '66 when he first screened Where No Man Has Gone Before, and who would become a good friend to Star Trek over the next 2 years, was there. And she remembered, quote, the very original march was when we, that's her husband John, were still up in Oakland. The Society for Creative Anachronism, or SCA, started the same year as Star Trek. It was started by a bunch of people in Berkeley who wanted to create medieval times. Most of us had some sort of costume, including a young man who made himself up as a Viking with a horned helmet. We were sitting around talking, decided it would be a fun thing to make an utterly harmless march on KRON and head out things on Star Trek. Gene had already put out the I Grok Spock bumper stickers, so we had things like that. We got there and KRON thought we were a riot and they locked the doors. They would come up occasionally and peer out the glass doors and see this crazy group of people with armor and skin costumes, which had to be pretty funny. There were maybe 15 of us, all armed. I mean, some of the guys were carrying swords. There were medieval costumes, after all. I can't imagine that those poor people inside were thinking. Oh, I can't imagine what those poor people inside were thinking. Well, pretty soon the police arrived and talked to us. They saw that we were harmless and not a mob of any kind, so they just warned us about any overt action against KRON. We gave them some I Grok Spock bumper stickers, and they put them on their police cars. Months later, we would see police cars, and they still had the stickers. I guess someone high up in the department was a fan of the show. Now, by early February, the cast had been released for summer hiatus with no word as to whether they were to return for a second season. Kuhn and Roddenberry, with Eddie Milkus and his team of editors and the various optical effects houses, still had post production to oversee, but this would only continue for another month. All others involved in the series, including Robert Justman and Dorothy Fontana, were sent home. It was an anxious time. Worse, it was a waste of time. If there was to be another season, stories needed to be developed, scripts needed to be written, and both needed to happen soon. Roddenberry went public with his discontent via Jack Hellman's column in the February 6, 1967 edition of Variety. Hellman spoke first, writing, if Star Trek doesn't make the cutoff, as they say in golf, and woe to those below its current 19.6 rating, not yet firm for the next go-round, it won't be because of Gene Roddenberry, its executive producer. It won't be because Gene Roddenberry hasn't given it a 7-day week and a few nights to bring it off as the best researched show on television. Roddenberry then responded, turning out an hour show every week and maintaining a consistent quality is asking too much of a producer. A schedule of every other week would result in better shows because of time allowances. It would also be advantageous if the network would give us an earlier pickup date so we can have the scripting of 8 or 10 shows completed during the summer layoffs. Buying properties for such a sci-fi series is not merely a matter of calling for scripts. We get our stories from so many different sources outside Hollywood that we must alert the writers that will be in the market for next season, but we're stymied and can't move when we should be reading scripts. Making statements to the press of this type did not help Roddenberry in his deteriorating relationships with NBC. Certain higher ups at the network were keeping mental lists of the growing strikes. And I'm not even going to go into all the strikes, but there's a lot of them. Things he had done to piss off NBC. Without official notification of a pickup, the policies of the Writers Guild of America prohibited Roddenberry from assigning stories for development. He did, however, have a filing cabinet filled with unused stories and scripts. He was tempted to revisit some just to have something on hand should the renewal come. The two teleplays from season one that had been rejected by NBC and still being considered by Roddenberry were the original episode 3, which was The Omega Glory, his post nuclear war parallel war story where the Asian communities or Asian communists had won and white skinned Americans had deteriorated into savagery. And the 28th episode that was written, which was the episode called Portrait in Black and White, another parallel war story that was set before the Civil War where blacks had enslaved whites. Roddenberry had written the first script, Barry Trivers the second, based on Roddenberry's story. And then there were a handful of scripts started at the end of the first year, but held over. One of those was Tomorrow the Universe from December 1966. This was Paul Schneider's third full script for Star Trek, on the heels of Balance of Terror and The Squire of Gothos. The subject dealt with a maverick member of the Federation who visited an Earth-like world circa 1930 and manipulated its society with a philosophy founded on absolute obedience to authority. Basically creating a government reminiscent of a certain group of bad Germans. The late season assignment was given to Schneider in case the troublesome script for The City on the Edge of Forever by Ellison didn't make it to camera. It did finally, and Tomorrow the Universe was put on hold. Another episode held over from the first season was Amok Time. Arriving on December 12, 1966, this was a late delivery from Theodore Sturgeon based on an idea from Roddenberry. The premise involves Spock's return to Vulcan to participate in a mating ritual. Following the shore leave ordeal of slow writing and worried that Sturgeon would not deliver the script on time, the story outline was paid for and then set aside. And then the other episode was Friday's Child, which came in on January 11th, 1967. With the ever reliable DC Fontana at the typewriter, this Don't Judge a Woman by Her Makeup story was earmarked as episode number 30 for season one. But by the time the story outline was delivered, NBC had cut back its order from 30 to 29 episodes, so the episode hadn't been developed further. And then NBC blinked just a little. The network agreed to put up $13,000 for story development. Roddenberry and Kuhn immediately took pitch meetings and rationed out the work. Oh, hello, Jay Rocker. Hello, thanks for stopping by. Good to see you here as always. So Paul Schneider, Theodore Sturgeon, and Dorothy Fontana were sent back to the scripts each had started at the end of season one. Robert Bloch returned for another job. Stephen Kandel was asked to do a Harry Mudd sequel, and new blood was supplied by Jerome Bixby, writer of nearly 50 short stories, Norman Spinrad, author of a pair of science fiction novels, and Gilbert Raston, who had written the pilot episode for The Wild Wild West. John Newbuell, I think it is, another Wild Wild West writer, the one who had created the character of Dr. Lovelace, and Lewis Reed, the writer of 55 episodes of Peter Gunn, were also brought on board. In late February, Broadcasting Magazine announced which NBC series were definitely being dropped. Star Trek was not on the list, but at the same time, it was still absent from the tentative fall schedule. At this point, there were only two primetime hours not yet spoken for: Tuesday 7:30 to 8:30 and Friday 8:30 to 9:30. Days later, on February 27th, Daily Variety published NBC's rough primetime schedule for the fall, and Star Trek was tentatively penciled in for Tuesday 7:30 to 8:30 p.m. There was a glimmer of hope. On March 4th, Star Trek had the cover of TV Guide. The episode that aired the week Devil in the Dark won the ratings in its time slot, but there was still no definite word directly from NBC. On March 6th, Ed Pearlstein, Desilu's legal rep, sent a letter to Marty Bume, William Shatner's agent. Pearlstein wrote that while Star Trek had yet to receive a pickup, the studio was expecting a renewal to come, and plans were being laid to resume production in late April. The big concern and reason for the letter was that Shatner was currently in Europe making a movie, as permitted by his contract after NBC had missed a deadline date for committing to a second season. With the clock ticking loudly, Pearlstein was hoping, should there be a launch, that Captain Kirk would make it back to the Enterprise. Things can take forever in television, and things can change in a minute. Later that same day, a Western Union telegram was dispatched to Shatner in Madrid, Spain. It read, quote, "Dear Bill, good news, official pickup today. Our 5-year mission continues, 8:30 every Friday night. Best regards, Gene Roddenberry." Shatner, like Kirk, would stop at nothing to make it back to his ship. Daily Variety ran the story the following day with its headline, "NBC TV Renewal for Star Trek," reporting the Thursday series had tentatively been moved to Tuesday 7:30 p.m. for next season, but now is on the schedule for 8:30 Fridays. In other words, the graveyard shift, a list about the worst slot you can get. The article revealed that a new variety series with Jerry Lewis had been planned for the less desirable Friday nighttime period, but last minute shuffling now put it on Tuesday in the slot Gene Roddenberry wanted Star Trek to have. Now, having survived Thursday nights from 8:30 to 9:30 against ABC's top series Bewitched and CBS's powerhouse Thursday night movie was no cakewalk. Yet Star Trek had persevered. The new time slot, however, posed an even greater challenge. It didn't take a programming genius to know that a series with a young adult audience would struggle on Fridays at 8:30 p.m. The high school and college student fan base were at football and basketball games, out on dates, at the movies, or at parties, anywhere but at home with mom and dad sitting in front of their TVs. So NBC did the smart thing at first and scheduled Star Trek for Tuesdays. The fall 1967 competition on this night was of little consequence. ABC was replacing the 5-year-old Combat and Garrison's Gorillas show, which would die after one season. CBS had Doctari, a moderate success in the middle of a 3-year run. Star Trek was expected to win its new time slot, but then its new time slot was stolen away. Simply put, Jerry Lewis was better liked at NBC than Gene Roddenberry was. With the new season came a new budget, a smaller one. It was now down from 195,000 per episode to 187,500 per episode. So far, only 4 episodes had been made for less than the first season cap of 195,000. Those were The Man Trap, The Naked Time, Charlie X, and Tomorrow Is Yesterday. 4 out of the 29 episodes in the first season. The new streamlined budget seemed impossible. Regardless, Desilu had little choice but to slash costs. With Star Trek and Mission Impossible both going into a second season and a third studio owned hour Mannix premiering on CBS, the question remained whether a small outfit like Lucille Ball's TV company, there it is, which was built on relatively inexpensive sitcoms filmed live before a studio audience, could afford to be so gutsy. Mission Impossible, although with a smaller audience share than Star Trek, had brought home numerous Emmy Awards, and its network had no issues with creator producer Bruce Geller. In time, the series would probably pay for itself. Star Trek, it was felt, was a different story. The network's hesitation to renew was a clear signal that the studio heads that the series might not make it into syndicated reruns. Quote, back then, the thinking was that you needed 150 or so episodes to have a strong syndication package, said John D.F. Black, Star Trek's first season associate producer. Quote, we made 26 to 30 episodes a season in those days, so the plan was to keep Kirk and his crew out there for 5 years. That's why it was a 5-year mission, and that's the only reason, unquote. So far, with the NBC pickup, Star Trek was only guaranteed 1.5 seasons. In the meantime, with the production of each new episode, Desilu went further into the red. A headline in the March 29, 1967 edition of Variety announced, quote, Desilu's budget soars to a record $21 million for 67-68 season. The previous year's budget was $15 million and was already breaking the bank. Now the old guard's predictions at the studio that Desilu might go bust was coming true. And then the for sale sign went up. Lucy needed to find a buyer or close up shop on Desilu within a year. With all this drama outside the soundstage, Star Trek's second season, what many to believe the original series' high watermark, was set to begin. And the problems continued. Leonard Nimoy, who received more mail and media attention than anyone else in the cast, wanted a raise. Nimoy knew his popularity was a double-edged sword and wanted to be compensated. As the public's love for Spock grew, the danger of being forever typecast as the guy with the ears was growing and growing. Nimoy's salary and freedom were controlled by his Star Trek contract. However, Alex Brewis, Nimoy's agent, believed a contract was not binding if the conditions under which it had been written no longer existed. Nimoy was originally hired to play a secondary character to Shatner's lead. It can now be argued, and it was, that Mr. Spock brought as much to Star Trek as Captain Kirk. The arguments between producer and actor are never limited to merely money. Nimoy also felt he, not only Roddenberry or Coons, should have a say when it came to his character. Roddenberry was livid over Nimoy's demands regarding creative control of Spock. Desilu was more concerned with an increase to the budget. Quote, the ramifications were huge, said Desilu head Herb Solo. The extra money demanded by Nimoy was bad enough. The problem was that if he got an increase, all the other contract actors would be standing in line for raises too. The studio, of course, refused. A minor verbal counteroffer was made, accompanied by subtle threats of suspension and legal action. Nimoy's camp responded, no raise, no deal. 2 days earlier, on March 30th, Joe DaGosta had prepared a list of actors who could join the cast as the new Vulcan. Mark Leonard, the Romulan commander in Balance of Terror, was at the top of the list. Another being seriously considered was Lawrence Montaigne. There he is. Who had appeared as Decius, the defiant Romulan officer in that same episode. Also on the short list was David Carradine, who would later appear on Kung Fu. Montaigne, who had more youth appeal than Mark Leonard and came closer to Nimoy's looks and physicality than Carradine, was selected. The studio took out an option guaranteeing the actor a part in at least one upcoming episode in exchange for him keeping his work schedule open for the possibility of landing the role. Solo was very direct with the message he delivered to Alex Brewis. Nimoy must report back to work with the contract he currently had or face termination and a lawsuit. Further, should Nimoy think Desilu was bluffing, the studio already had someone to take his place. Solo told Brewis, it's not important who plays the role. Any good actor can do that. It's the pointed ears that count. They're the star. And Nimoy did have a response to this.
And preferring Ston over me.
Yeah, he didn't like that. Now, on April 6th, an incensed Leonard Nimoy fired off a letter to his own Desilu legal rep, Ed Pearlstein. In part, he wrote, under the terms and conditions as stated in the contract and as subsequently amended in your verbal offer, I do not feel I can perform the services you call for. Since the studio has chosen to take a freeze attitude, I am prepared to deal with whatever consequences may arise from my action. I feel in all fairness that you are entitled to as much advance notice of my intentions as possible. And then a third party got involved. Herb Solo revealed, quote, NBC, the original campaigner against the Spock character, and the pointed ears, hearing through Leonard's agent that he might walk off the show, was furious. The network had been monitoring the influx of fan mail and understood the importance of Nimoy to Star Trek. Solo was told to keep Spock on the Enterprise. There would be no further discussion. Nimoy won the battle by getting a raise he originally had in mind, not the one his agent had asked for. In addition, Nimoy would receive $100 per episode for expenses. He also received a more lucrative merchandising deal. To Roddenberry's chagrin, there was one last concession. Nimoy was guaranteed a right to give input on the scripts. Of course, Roddenberry wasn't happy about that, but NBC had its own opinion.
An absolute win.
Okay. In another attempt to keep Leonard Nimoy from getting too much credit, a change was made to the opening title sequence. Oh, yeah. Where is that? Yeah, there we go. Gene Roddenberry's name now came before Nimoy's. Star Trek, created by Gene Roddenberry and starring William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy's Mr. Spock, and the creator's name would return at the end of the episode as executive producer. Herb Solo said, quote, I am again marveled at Gene's seemingly unending drive to fashion himself as the sole master and absolute proprietor of Star Trek, unquote. There was another change in the credits, but this one involving DeForest Kelley didn't seem to upset anyone. Robert Justman was the instigator of the change. He later said, it became apparent to me as well as Gene very early on that the character of McCoy was going to be a linchpin, a fulcrum upon which one side was balanced with the other. Dee was very effective in this role, and I was very aware of this. On December 1st, 1966, Justman wrote Roddenberry stating his desire to provide Kelly with better compensation, including a more visible credit, because of the performance he gives us and because Kelly was, quote, one hell of a nice guy. Justman added, quote, he has been more than the kindly ship's doctor to all of us. And of course, he did wind up getting that credit in the opening of the show. Kelly said, quote, I guess I finally realized the popularity of Star Trek and the success of my role when people began stopping me on the street to comment on it. Kelly said the November 1967 issue of TV Star Parade said in that issue, this tremendous interest is something I hadn't been accustomed to. I'd been fighting the heroes a long time, making a good living playing heavies. Then this series came along, it kind of shook me. It changed my image. I'm not a heavy any longer, and I'm working every day with the same people. It's interesting. A whole new thing happened to me when our spaceship blasted off. For a tabloid interview in 1967, he said, quote, the greatest luxury I've allowed myself is an electric garage door opener that gives me the greatest kick. And now that the garage was easier to get into, he purchased another kick, a new Thunderbird. Nimoy used his raise and salary to replace his old battered car with a new Buick. And yeah, there it is. Fortunately, both could now afford auto insurance. George Takei was given a raise as well, and James Doohan remained at 850 per segment with a guarantee of 7, although everyone knew he would wind up doing more. Nichelle Nichols was not as quick to re-enlist. She had envisioned a much bigger part for herself in Star Trek. There was no question that she had been given a few good moments, Despite this, Nichelle felt that the character of Uhura had been underappreciated. In an article for the July 15th, 1967 issue of TV Guide entitled Let Me Off at the Next Planet, she complained, quote, "My problem is being a black woman on top of being a woman." Elsewhere in the article, she said, quote, "The producers admit being very foolish and very lax in the way they've used me or not used me." In her book Beyond Uhura, Nichols told how she was denied respect. Case in point, she recalled discovering that someone in the Desilu mailroom had stopped the delivery of the bulk of her mail. Two workers from the department confided to the actress that most of her mail was being held back and told her, "Yours is the only fan mail that matches Shatner and Nimoy's." And days later, I saw for myself the boxes and bags of mail from all over the country, from adults and children, all colors, all races. To say I was stunned does not even begin to convey how I felt. It was just fan mail, but to those who had ensured that I worked without a contract, who seemed at every turn to remind me that I was dispensable, this was the ultimate humiliation. So she was looking at maybe leaving the show and was, as she says, it was going to leave the show. Of course, then she related the whole story, which I'm sure everybody knows about, how she met Martin Luther King at this some kind of a dinner, and he encouraged her to stay on the show, and so she wound up sticking around. Okay, and then of course there were also some new faces that would wind up joining Star Trek this season, or at least one new face. It had been in the works for a while, as early as September 22nd, 1966. Just weeks after the premiere of The Monkees, Roddenberry sent a memo to character Joe DaGosta, saying, quote, "Keeping our teenage audience in mind, also keeping aware of current trends, let's watch for a young, irreverent English accent Beatle type to try on the show, possibly with an eye to him recurring, like the smallish fellow Davy Jones, who looked to be so hot on the Monkees. Personally, I find this type spirited and refreshing and think our episodes could fit that kind of lift, or could use that kind of lift." Then the irreverent English accent Beatle type became an irreverent Russian accent Beatle type. Although no one has been able to confirm the story, Roddenberry related how an article in Pravda, the official newspaper of the Communist Party, criticized Star Trek as being typically capitalistic. Allegedly, Pravda's main complaint was that on the ship with a crew supposedly representing all the countries of Earth, there were no Russians. Helping to add validity to the story, which many people over the years have dismissed as a publicity stunt, is an October 10th, 1967 letter that Roddenberry wrote for Mikhail V. Zemyanin, who was the editor of Pravda, editor of the Central editor of Pravda, Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Moscow, Russia. Roddenberry informs Yanin in this letter that he had learned of the article concerning Star Trek and that the series now had a Russian serving on board the Enterprise. His name, Pavel Andreevich Chekhov. However, there is no evidence that this Yanin person ever responded. And I do remember, after the Soviet Union fell, and the Soviet Union opened up somewhat. The government did. I remember some people tried to find this article, track down this article that Roddenberry had claimed had been published, and no one has ever been able to find any proof that this article was ever published, and no one at Pravda at the time recalled this article. Like, we don't know what you're talking about. We don't remember anything about that. So, I mean, seems very likely that Roddenberry just made that up. Quote, "The Chekhov thing was a major error on our part," Roddenberry said in 1968, "and I'm still embarrassed that we didn't include a Russian right from the beginning. However, now it's Russia's turn to be embarrassed." As for the casting of Chekhov, director Joseph Pevney made a suggestion. He had worked with a young actor named Walter Koenig on an episode of Outrage Hitchcock Presents and felt Koenig would make an interesting Russian type fellow. The episode of Hitchcock called Memory from Purgatory had been written by Star Trek veteran and now opponent Harlan Ellison. Koenig recalled, quote, I was starring opposite James Caan. James was the good guy and I was the bad guy. Joe kept saying, you're going to be a star. Well, James Caan became a star. I finished the show and went home to my usual life. But Joe really came through by getting me onto Star Trek. Gene Coon, however, had another actor in mind, although the production records for Star Trek do not specify who it was. What is known is that Coon's choice was invited in for a reading, and Koenig was as well. Quote, we both read, and afterwards I didn't even get to go home, Koenig reminisced. I just sat around for 40 minutes, and then Bill Tice, the wardrobe director, came in and said, follow me. He took me to wardrobe where he got out one of those measuring tapes and he started measuring me from head to toe. And I said, what are you doing? And then he said, I've got to make you a uniform. You just got hired. I swear that's how I found out I had the part. No congratulations, no ceremony, just this guy with a tape measure between my legs. It certainly did not hint at the significance Star Trek would ultimately have in my life. Koenig was told this job would be a one shot, a single assignment for the episode Cat's Paw, and for that he was given a Beatles type wig to wear. Quote, 2 weeks later, he was back for Friday's Child, then several days later for Who Mourns for Adonias, and several days after that for Amok Time. Koenig's involvement was both sudden and immense, and that displeased George Takei. At the end of the first season, Takei had approached Roddenberry and Coon explaining why Sulu should be given a bigger role on the series. He appreciated the standout parts he had been given in a number of episodes, but like Nichelle Nichols, he believed his character had been underused. He hoped there would be more to do in the new season. Takei left the producer's office, assured that there would certainly be more business for Sulu in the future. However, when Takei returned from the summer break, he discovered that the story points and lines of dialogue normally assigned to Sulu were now being shared with his new partner at the helm, Chekhov. For his memoir, Takei wrote, "The spirited lobbying that I had mounted, oh, excuse me, the spirited lobbying I had mounted to enhance Sulu's role had been all for naught. I had gained nothing but a new competitor. I was prepared to dislike this interloper, this thief of my efforts. All right, I'll admit it. I hated him. Sight unseen, I churned with venom for this Walter Koenig. This Walter sailed into our second season on the wings of fate, wearing a silly Prince Valiant wig and plucked off the fruits that rightfully belonged to me." Adding insult to injury, Takei was asked to share his dressing room with Koenig, and because of this, he remembered the veins in his scalp swelling up. Interviewed for this book, Koenig said, quote, George writes that he felt threatened by my presence, that he hated me, but I didn't see that. And I'm a pretty sensitive guy. I can sense when somebody is unhappy with me. I never had the feeling. But then again, he is so stoic. When I read his book that he felt that way, I was really surprised. I was shocked. He had turned it off so well. Koenig didn't notice it because the bitterness was short lived. Takei met Koenig and was convinced that he was obsessing over how terrible he looked in that wig. Quote, I feel ridiculous with this on, Takei recalled him complaining. I feel like a walking joke. Koenig, however, remembers it differently and said, quote, I wasn't as uncomfortable with it as I've been made out to be. My hair had already started to thin, and I sort of liked the fact that I had a full head of hair. It was just that it was far more youthful than I was. And I didn't realize this, but Koenig was already 30 years old when he got the role of Chekhov. I didn't realize he was that old. I would have guessed he was like 25, 26, something like that. Chekhov was supposed to be 22, but Koenig was 30. But Takei thought the wig looked silly, and therefore he was sure Walter must have felt the same way. And because of this, something odd happened. Takei admitted, quote, even in my hatred, I couldn't help but feel a bit sorry for Walter. He looked so pathetic. All the bile that churned inside me began to dissolve at the sight of another actor reduced to public humiliation every time he stepped in front of the camera. Suddenly, Takei had a reason to bond with Koenig. They could sit side by side at the helm and suffer the slings and arrows of being supporting players, and they would become friends. And there was also someone else new on the set, and that was Charles Washburn. He was one of the first African Americans to enter the Directors Guild of America's apprentice training program, which was added to the crew, who was added to the crew as an assistant director. A small part of Washburn's daily routine was to check in with Shatner, Nimoy, and Nichols, who arrived at 6:30 a.m. for makeup call. Nichols needed her eye makeup, Nimoy his ears, and Shatner his hairpiece. Kelly, Dewitt, Takei, and Koenig arrived at 7:15. They required less work. Washburn would also take the breakfast orders. On set, among other things, the new AD was in charge of the turbo lift doors. I manned the button for the doors to swoosh open, Washburn said. No matter how Shatner pivoted, hesitated, or changed, I would key the man on the doors just right. Al, the man on the doors, an old timer described as well past his game and worn out, was wedged into a tiny hot space. Sometimes Al got sleepy as the cast and crew went through setups and shots and retakes. Quote, I didn't know this, Washburn said, but the guys did. The guys included Shatner, who often made the Christmas party blooper reel, bouncing off the doors with amused surprise. Then someone in the crew would yell, check the light. The light triggered by Washburn's button would tell the old fellow in the dark space to pull the turbolift doors open. Everyone knew the light was working fine, but the light was always blamed to spare the dignity and, more importantly, preserve the job of Al, the turbolift doorman. Check the light was crew lingo for wake up Al. Hello, Gragnar. Good to see you, man. Thank you for stopping by. With Al awake, Walter Koenig wearing his wig, Nimoy and Nichols back in the fold, Kelly assured co-starring status, and Shatner having come back from Spain just in the nick of time, the first episode of Star Trek's second season was ready to begin principal photography. The script, which offered generous portions of both tricks and treats, was appropriately called Cat's Paw. Okay, so as I said, I'll get into Cat's Paw next week. So that will be it for this stream. Again, thanks to those who tuned in for the stream and those who will check it out on a rewatch. So let's see what else. Okay, so I did put up a reaction to that Fantastic Four teaser trailer from earlier today. So if you would, please do check that out. And later this evening, I'm probably going to be posting another video, which will be my top 5 best Marvel villains for Superman, if Marvel villains were in the DC universe. And then after that, well, I should be streaming this weekend on Sunday like I usually do. And again, Cat's Paw will be the Trek Talk for next week. Thanks to those who tuned in again. Please do like this stream before you leave, and please do sub to the channel. And I will see you all next time. Have a good evening.